The program. This is Chuck Morse, Left Right Radio with Chuck Morse, Monday through Friday, 12 noon. My guest is Dr. Charles Jacobs, named by the Forward as one of America's top 50 Jewish leaders. Charles Jacobs is a journalist and a longtime social activist who over 2 decades has founded human rights and pro-Israel organizations to deal with unmet challenges, including CAMERA, the American Anti-Slavery Group, and the David Project, all very prominent groups here in Boston, most recently Americans for Peace and Tolerance. Charles, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks for having me, Chuck.
Charles, just before we get into the present issue, which is what's going on in the affluent suburb of Newton, Massachusetts, I'd like you to talk a little bit about how a man of your position, a Harvard PhD, an intellectual, how did you get involved in this work, which brought you to the South Sudan, and it's brought you on a mission that has really spanned the globe?
Well, in the 1990s and early 2000s, I learned that Black people could be bought and sold as chattel slaves in parts of North Africa. I had been I'd been a human rights activist from high school. I remember I was in the NAACP chapter in my high school in my early college days. I was actually an anti-war activist way back then. And I couldn't believe that, one, you could still buy and sell Black people in the world at the time for $15 or $20 in Sudan. And even more, that nobody cared about it, that the human rights community, I eventually found that they did some reports on this, but it was sitting in the back of their file cabinets. Nobody was mobilizing to free Black slaves today, like they would have like they did mobilize to end apartheid in South Africa. And so it became to me, an intellectual puzzle as to why this happened, which is interesting. I'm writing a book about this. And then I found diaspora elements of 2 African countries in New York City, the Mauritanians and the Sudanese people. And they told me they've been knocking on the doors of churches, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and nobody cared about the fact that their people were being enslaved. And I mean enslaved. I mean, buying and sold, chattel slave. Mm-hmm. These people could be passed down through the master's estate to be inherited like furniture. And then I put together a coalition of Mauritanians and Sudanese, and then we met a fantastic group out of Switzerland, Christian Solidarity International, who was working in Sudan to try to help the Southern Christian Black Sudanese who were being massacred. Here, some people call it the hidden Holocaust. 3 million people were slaughtered in what now we know, I didn't know at the time, was a jihad. It was a holy war against the Black African South. And so I wrote a piece in the New York Times that broke the story with a Mauritanian Muslim partner of mine. And since then, people encouraged us to create a movement to free the slaves, and we did, the American Anti-Slavery Group. And I was convinced by my hero, John Eibner of Christian Solidarity International, to go with him illegally into southern Sudan and to witness and report on the redemption of Black slaves from Arabs. And I did it. And I did it twice on Pesach, on Passover. I mean, what else should you be doing on Passover? Right? So I was very proud of that, and it's probably a high point in my career, watching people being bought out of chattel slavery, and it still goes on, and still the human right. We can talk about that's a whole nother program. Is why the left and the progressives don't care about victims.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to ask before we go into Newton. It's like, why does the establishment left, the far left, the American left, who are supposed to be so concerned, or at least they pose it themselves as being concerned with, these issues of human rights, and they call themselves quote social justice?
It's the question of the day, and here's the answer.
Why are they not? Where are they?
Okay, here it is on one foot. It's a long thing, but on one foot. So who is the human rights contingency in America, in the West. It's decent white people mostly who are burdened by the claims that the West is imperialist, racist, and lives on undeserved wealth of others, right? That's who they are.
Right. Okay.
So when they see, or when they think they see evil done by people like themselves, like in South Africa, those apartheid nicks were white like themselves, they see this as a platform for themselves to say, I'm not that bad white guy, right? I mean, it's good that they do that.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But when they see evil done by non-Westerners, they choke. They feel they have, first of all, no moral standing. Who are we who had black slaves to talk about other people who had black slaves? We were as guilty as they are. And also, it gets them off their main goal, which is to show that the West, yes, is guilty, but I am not. So if you show them, and by the way, there's a category of victims of non-Western oppression that goes beyond black slaves to women in the Islamic world, to Christians in the Islamic world, to gays. They're all silent about that because that gets in the way of their main goal, which is to proclaim, I'm different than the bad West, I'm a good guy. So they've abandoned the people who most are in need of human rights power. And the first group was the black slaves in Sudan, Mauritania. And now there are 5 African countries in which Arabs and Muslims have black slaves. And, you can't get the so-called human. So the human rights community basically is a hoax.
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, what their position is actually quite racist when it comes to the black slaves, because, I mean, they're not only condoning by inaction and by refusing to identify this issue, the fact that there are black slaves, but they're saying that somehow black people are not, I don't know, it has like a kind of a white man's burden, old-fashioned racism quality to it, that they don't have the ability of white people to have these moral standards, that they don't somehow know any better, that somehow slavery could be overlooked because they're themselves, ignorant, or they need to have the great white administrator to rule over them. And of course, these are the same people that ignored the horrendous, atrocious crimes of Stalin and Mao Zedong and all the rest. I mean, so, for them to take any kind of a moral position is just ludicrous. It's entirely situational. They'll take a moral position if they think it's going to advance their agenda, which I think is socialism, and they're going to ignore situations morally by which that are not going to advance that agenda. But I want to talk a little bit also about this situation in Newton, Massachusetts, liberal, relatively affluent community just west of Boston, very high percentage of Jewish residents. They say about 35-40% of Newton is Jewish. And you have a situation where the school department, and the high school in particular, over a long period of time, has introduced viciously anti-Israel, anti-Semitic curricula and movies. Now, this isn't a legitimate conversation about the Israel-Arab conflict where reasonable people can differ. We're talking about what by any standards could be defined as old-fashioned propaganda, where it's almost like a blood libel, that the Israelis are like Nazis and that they're committing genocide and this kind of stuff. And your group has exposed it. That exposure has fallen upon deaf ears in that community. I got to see this firsthand just the other night attending the school board meeting, where the issue was brought up directly to these school board members who sat there like a bunch of stones, expressionless. And this particular superintendent of schools, Dr. David Fleischman, who directly oversaw this and who sat there utterly expressionless as this issue was exposed. So, Charles, give me a little bit of a thumbnail in terms of what's been going on in Newton, how long it's been going on, and a little chronology on that.
Sure. About 5 or 6 years ago, a father of a Newton high school student came to us and said, my daughter came back from Newton High School. I think it was Newton South, or I'm not sure if it was North or South. and wanted to know, is it true, Daddy, that Jews in Israel murder Arab women in Israeli jails? I said, what? What? Where'd you get that? So she shows me her assignment, and it comes from a book called the Arab World Studies Notebook. So the Arab World Studies Notebook is funded by the Saudi Arabians. So somehow the Saudis reached their long hand into American classrooms and is poisoning people about this. So we got very upset. We went to the school. He went to the school. And they said, well, what do you mean? We got this from Harvard. Our teachers went to the Harvard Middle East Studies Center. The outreach guy there gave him an all-day seminar on what to teach. We got these materials, and it was a lot more than just that one. And so it's Harvard, it's kosher. Then we found out that the Harvard Middle East Studies Center was run by a guy who was a BDS advocate, an anti-Israel advocate, that the center had gotten money from the Arab Emirates and from Saudi, and that they were teaching propaganda from Harvard.
I think there was a big story about the fact that they got accepted a $300 million endowment from the Saudis that had previously been declined by Georgetown University, I believe.
First of all, we helped force Harvard to reject a $2 million gift. Couldn't stop them from taking, I think it was $40 million. I mean, that's a little bit harder to stop them from taking. That's
right.
That's hardball.
That's bigger money.
Yeah. So there you have, this curriculum mill, anti-Israel curriculum mill funded by Saudi Arabia, going through Harvard right into the Newton School teachers' minds. And so that was the first one. And then there were more. They had a Hamas charter that the kids were studying. That was a falsified Hamas charter. And it took out of the real Hamas charter that we want every Jew in the world to be dead, right? And then we got the teacher's notes, and the teacher's notes said, this conflict has to be taught as a conflict over land, not religion. Well, it's really not. So Hamas now seems to many, many Newton School students as a reasonable organization when it is a genocidal killing group.
Now, let me just interject here also and point out that Hamas remains on the Attorney General's list and has been so since the Clinton administration as a terrorist group. Why could it be? How could it be that they're openly advocating and their materials are being used in an American high school?
How could it be? I mean, I think American high schools could use Hamas literature if it was legitimate Hamas literature, and the point could be made, look at this genocidal group. Don't tell me that this is only a war about land and borders. This is a war about religious, subjugation of other people. And then they had this series of PLO maps. They got the maps straight from the PLO itself, but somehow when the students were given these maps, the PLO imprimatur was taken off. So the students didn't even know they were being given propaganda maps. So it went on and on and on. And we have a 20-minute film that people could see at peaceandtolerance.org, A-N-D, peaceandtolerance.org. Click on K-12, click on Newton, and you'll see a 20-minute expose of all of these materials. So we went and we protested, and they said, what do you mean this is critical thinking? And we said, no, it's not critical thinking. It's, critical thinking would be to show what they actually are producing over there in the Arab world, and then ask the students, teach them about propaganda and hatred and religious conflict. That would be critical thinking. So the Jewish community was for 5 years in an uproar. I have to say the establishment part of the Jewish community didn't want to fight this fight, just like they don't want to. And I'm talking about the ADL, the AJC, the JCRC, CJP. They don't want to have fights about what's being taught in college campuses or in high schools because they're afraid that the charge will be laid against them that you're stopping academic freedom with your Jewish power, which is what would happen if they fought it.
That's
what
right.
we said about them. But they don't want to take the heat of that, and so they let this fester for 5 years. Finally, the ADL goes to, in large part because they were pressed by the grassroots organizations, do something. They go to see David Fleischman, and he says to them, you know what? You must have a point here. Let's stop teaching all of this business until we can find legitimate, vettable, scholarly-based materials. And that's what and there's a letter that says that's what he said, okay? Next thing you know, so we did a FOIA. We did a Freedom of Information request, and we got materials that showed that was a lie. They didn't stop it when they said they stopped it.
Let me just interject here also.
Yeah.
It's outrageous that a parent group or anybody, an American citizen, a resident of Newton, would have to get freedom of information to find out what's going on in the schools.
Well, I have to tell you, the biggest fight is about transparency, because if, there are school districts that just put online what they teach, Right. So the new mayor of Newton, Ruth Ann Fuller, during her debates for the mayoral office for the election, was pressed, I think, by Tom Mountain or by some, Republicans. Well, are you going to stand for transparency given this concern on the part of the Jews? And she said, absolutely, it's going to be transparent. Well, that hasn't happened. And the biggest explosion happened the other day. You saw it. You were there. When we found out, and we had to find out through, skullduggery, or, we just read the Newton students' newspapers in there. So they had a whole day on the Middle East conflict. It was a school-wide assembly in which many bad things happened, but the worst thing was this film that the kids watched called Ismail. Now, many people watching this will know that the Arab Islamic anti-Israel propaganda is famous for doing lots of things. One of them is they took that famous iconic picture of a little Jewish boy in the Warsaw Ghetto with his hands up, with a Nazi soldier behind him, and they turned it around and they made the kid a Palestinian and the Nazi soldier an Israeli.
Oh my God.
That everybody knows that one. Well, this film did it better. They got a scene right out of Schindler's List. Looks just like all of the scenes you ever saw in documentaries where Jews were hustled out of their homes, put in long lines, and marched to the trains, right? Well, in this film, you see a bunch of innocent, nice Arab women, men, children, grandmas being marched through 1948, the Nakba, being marched through, and you have this IDF soldier acting exactly like we all know the Germans did, Mach Schnell, and beating the guy in the head with his rifle butt. So this is Jew as Nazi. Well, I got to tell you, Jew as Nazi is the meme that's chasing the Jews out of Europe, that is threatening the lives and is actually murdering Jewish people in lots of, and this is what's now in the public schools of Newton, Massachusetts.
Now, does the situation in Newton, is that going on in widely in other school systems around the country?
It's all over. Look, you would expect it. All of the people who go to college, many of them are radicalized. Many of the teachers who are going to be teachers are radicalized on college campuses. And they come into public school settings where they do whatever they want, really, because there's no it's very, very hard, actually, to monitor what teachers teach now because it's not just textbooks. They pull it down from the internet. They go to these, there are curriculum mills from the left and from the Muslims and from the Arabs, all of whom have developed slick, pedagogically correct materials, easily taught lesson plans with lots of picture, all the modern stuff, pictures and audio and visual, and it's prepackaged and it just flows into the minds of the teachers. And, these teachers are not Middle East experts. They're high school teachers. So it's happening all over.
Helpful to expose their names and to publicize that. I know that we obviously David Fleischman, that's a name that's out there, and he's the superintendent. He's fully conscious and witting about what's going on in the schools. He's hiding.
He has to be fired. He has to be fired.
He has to be fired.
Ruth Goldman is the current president or chairperson of the Newton School Committee. When she was asked about this, she said, "Well, what do you mean? It was an assembly that the students themselves created. So after you've poisoned them about Israel, then you let them go and create something,
or at least have a pro-Israel, representative there to counter this."
There was none. There was none.
Now he was. You're in the defensive, yeah. Now, at this meeting, as you say, you called for him to resign. Tom Mountain, who was there speaking, he called for him to resign. Margot Einstein, a longtime activist, and she's like in her 90s. She's an amazing dynamo of a woman. She called for him to be outright fired, and she also called for the head of the school committee to be fired.
Right. Everybody ought to just thank God for this woman, Margot Einstein.
Oh, yeah.
Right. She's over 90 years old. I call her the spiritual Viagra of Zionism in New England. She's done more than anybody. I mean, while our established Jewish leaders are sitting there with their fat salaries and their, hobnobbing and maybe going behind the scenes to, they tell us to do good things. Margot's out there day and night just pushing and pushing. She's magnificent.
Will there be a resignation? Do you think there'll be a firing or not?
Not unless the entire Jewish community gets outraged, and I'm trying to show them this film. I mean, all you got to do is show them this film. We're trying to set up community-wide lectures about this. It's only going to happen if the ADL and the JCRC get on board and get outraged. And it looks like they might be being pushed that way because they were lied to. They're annoyed at that, I know. They wrote a letter to Fleischman, a very different kind of letter. It was very harsh. And it came out Monday, the day of the meeting. So I think that things may be going. But, grassroots groups can only light fires. And the biggest fire we have to light is under the seats of our Jewish leadership. Because if the community sees that those people who speak with the voice of Boston Jewry are really upset about this, that's something.
Now, what do you think makes a guy like David Fleischman tick? I mean, he's probably nominally Jewish. He has a Jewish last name. I don't know that. But what is the deal with him? Why would he allow? I mean, how could he Tom Mountain laid it out perfectly. Where's his shame? I mean, doesn't he have any dignity that he would allow something like this to happen in the school with this kind of blood libel against the Jewish people? I mean, what is this about?
So there are only hypotheses because we can't read his mind. So I'll give you a few hypotheses. One is he's just a bureaucrat, and bureaucrats circle the wagons when they're caught or when something bad happens within their organization. They might not have known about it, but they don't want to take the hit of saying, oh, my God, we let Arab propaganda seep in. We said to them, we forced them to remove the Arab World Studies notebook. That was one victory, right? And I said, so gather back all of those students who you taught that the Jews murder Arab women in jails in Israel and tell them that this was a terrible thing. It was a mistake. It was propaganda. We're going to show you use it as critical thinking exercise. We're going to show you how propaganda works. Mea culpa, mea culpa. That would have been the mensch-like thing and the proper and the moral thing to do. He wouldn't do it. He just said, well, we removed it because it was old, right? No. He said it was old. I said, do you mean so the Jews stopped murdering the Arabs in jails? Is that what you But he doesn't have to answer. He just sat, as you saw.
Yeah, I mean, that's
so why is it? So hypothesis A, is that he's just a bureaucrat and he got caught, and like all bureaucrats, they don't want to admit error. Hypothesis B, he doesn't have any clue of what's being taught. And he wouldn't care because he probably is, hypothesis C, a lefty. I mean, he might say, well, look, all we're teaching here is what the Boston Globe would teach about the Middle East.
That makes it right. That's the standard.
That's another
it's an establishment view. But it goes a little bit to the left of the establishment, because I don't think most Jewish liberals, left-leaning Jews are gonna buy this. I mean,
this is good, because this went way beyond what you're right. What even the Boston Globe would do. Even the Boston Globe would do.
Oh, yeah.
So you're right. So I think he's got caught on this one, and I think this is different than before, because this is a whole day without a pro-Israel voice, a whole day where they had the entire high school able to see this film and other films. There were other things that we're just discovering that might have been even worse. We don't know, because, as you know, there's no transparency. Mm-hmm. So we've issued another Freedom of Information Act today. And by the way, this costs money to do. They don't.
It's outrageous. And it's outrageous that it would have to be done like that. You should just walk into the school and take a look at it. This is a public school that's funded by the taxpayers. What the hell? I mean, that to me is unbelievable.
Go back to your other point.
Yeah.
What's most dangerous? You know, my wife thinks that this is the worst possible thing that could happen to the Jewish community. Worse than on the college campuses, even. Because if you got, everybody goes to high school. You know, my postman doesn't go to college, but my postman goes to high school. So if the garage guy and the mechanic and the maid and the postman are going to hate the Jews, that's like everybody. So, and this is happening all over the country. Right
here in the heart of Newton, a very predominantly Jewish community. It's like having a Klan meeting in a black neighborhood. I mean, I know maybe I'm being a little too stark on that.
Well, don't forget that there's an awful lot of Jews who don't like Israel, right?
And a growing number. I want to get into that, but in fact, I've noticed even in this past year or two, there's been a growth in this movement called the Jewish Voices for Peace, right. And it's made up of very left-leaning and left-wing Jews who are openly anti-Israel. When I say anti-Israel, they don't want to see Israel exist. Right. They want to see it replaced by some kind of a democratic entity. Why not have Iran become a democratic entity? I mean, right. They're focused on Israel, and it mimics a lot of the propaganda that's coming out of Hamas. Why do you think so many young, intelligent Jewish kids are getting sucked into this?
So, let's start at 50,000 feet. The bigger problem that leads to this is why are the Jews so bad at their own PR, and why have they allowed their youth to be taken over by the left, right? So the best writer on this is Ken Levin, Andrea Levin's husband. She's the founder of Camera. So he says, he's a psychiatrist. And he says, think about the case of the abused wife. So a wife whose husband beats her, it's classically known that this is what will happen. She will go to the psychiatrist and she'll say, it must have been something I did that made him hit me. Now, why does she do that? She does that because if it is something she did, she can change her behavior and he will stop hitting her. If it's nothing that she did, if the hatred just comes irrationally, then her fate is terrible, doomed, right? Well, the Jews are an abused people, right? For thousands of years. We want to think it's something we did that we could change and not die, that we could change and they'll stop hating us. So that's a psychological problem of many, many Jews. The Jewish left has never been comfortable with Jewish power, right? The Jewish left are people who would like to escape the burdens of being a Jew. In the old days, Marxism offered them the easiest way out. I didn't have to be a Christian, which would really be a traitor way back.
Well, right? It abolishes religion altogether.
Right. So I could be you, Chuck Morse and Charles Jacobs. You're little tribalists. You care for this little tiny group of people. I care for the entire international proletariat. You see? So if we could just unburden ourselves from this tribal identity and join the international world, then all this hatred would dissipate, and that's what would be good. And that's where they are. So Jewish Voice for Peace has swallowed the left and the Arabist charges against Israel and has adopted them. And it's a sick, sick thing.
Who's behind it? Is it George Soros? I mean, who's financing them?
Well, I think I can't say for sure, but I think it's people like George Soros behind it. But if it weren't him, it would exist anyway, not as powerful, because there is this tendency for people to escape the burdens that they have. Even good Jewish kids find it difficult to stand up on college campuses and stand for Israel. And even the ones who have, a good Jewish upbringing and even the Zionist sentiment, even they find it difficult. So imagine people who don't have that, or people who have turned against it. This is their escape route. I'm the good Jew. I'm the one, who cares more about the stranger, than my family.
I've noticed that a lot of the young people involved in this movement are from mixed marriages. They don't have a lot of Jewish background. They're resentful toward Judaism, maybe because it doesn't conventionally recognize them as Jewish. There's some kind of a chip on the shoulder, usually from the parent or both parents in some cases, about Judaism. And also, it's classic from a political standpoint. It's a classic leftist paradigm in that they despise Israel for two reasons. Firstly, because it's capitalist, and it's a country that has a startup nation where the people thrive economically, where they can become successful, where they can develop business which respects private ownership. And secondly, they despise it because it's Jewish. It's regardless of one's religious observance or beliefs, it is a nation that has declared itself as a believer in God and as a believer that it has a certain divine mission. Even the most secular Jews understand that. And that is, both of those things, of course, are seen as obstacles to a leftist vision of the world. They hate nationalism. They hate borders, as we know in the United States. We could get into that. But, they don't like the idea of the nation state because they believe in some kind of a bizarre one world ant colony where everybody's actually de facto equal. So Israel is a strong nationalist, religious state and a capitalist state. So it represents all of the obstacles politically that the left sees standing in the way of their bizarre utopian view. And I think that young people get sucked into that and always have. I mean, it goes way back. I mean, don't forget the Nazi Party was made up primarily of college students and young people. They get involved in these utopian, socialistic movements, and often they come from families that don't have much rooting in faith or in understanding of, conservative ideals, I suppose.
I'll tell you that the biggest threat to Jewish life today is not the right. Is not the Nazis and the Christian anti-Semites. I mean, they'll always be there.
They've always been around. That's not changing, of course.
It's not changing, but it's not the biggest threat. The biggest threat is the alliance between the radical left and radical Islamists, right? The red-green alliance, right? So you have to ask yourself, how can it be that the left, people who like, gender fluidity, nipple rings, bikinis, right? Yeah. Link up with people in the Muslim world for whom every one of those things is a death penalty, right? How can there be a burqa?
How can they be? They're throwing gay people off the top of buildings, and women are put into like a virtual I've seen as property.
Right. So how can there be a burqa bikini alliance? Right? How can that happen? So the answer is just like what you said. They have on one foot. They have certain things in common. They both hate Judeo-Christianity. They both want a one-world state. For them, it's the caliphate, and for the left, it's the one-world UN business with no borders.
Whatever, yeah.
And they both hate capitalism. So they have those three things in common. Now, the left, because it still thinks in Marxist terms, much of it, is under the misapprehension that religion is the opiate of the people. And as soon as these Muslims, get jobs, they'll drop Allah and they'll join the. So it's going to go the other way. I mean, the left will be eaten by.
Of course, they'll be the first ones to go.
They'll be the first ones to go.
Now, Charles, you're a long time, I would say, in the real meaning of the word, a social justice warrior in the real sense, not in the left sense. I guess I'd ask you the question that Lenin asked in his famous treatise: what can be done? Where do we go from here in terms of countering this insidious growth? Because it has to be met either openly or by some other means. And if it's not met, I fear that it's going to continue to metastasize.
Okay, so how much time you got for that? I mean, Lenin wrote like a short little pamphlet, what is to be done? Okay, so here we go. 1, 2, 3. Number one, anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism in the West, anyway, is a derivative of postmodernism, political correctness, right? Mm-hmm. So that every school child in America is being taught a set of axioms about life in the social world that are untrue. For example, the only reason for conflict is miscommunication. The problem in the world is that some people have too much power and some have too little. And so what you've got to do is to give those people who don't have power more power. That's Obama. We live in the West, we live on undeserved wealth. That darker skinned people and poor people have a higher moral claim. That there is no truth, but that all narratives are equally valid. That all cultures are equally morally valid. I mean, that's what all of the students are learning. So once you've learned that, anti-Israelism falls out of the bottom of that because the Jews are, as you say, we're white. Oh, guess what? They used to kill us because we weren't white. Right? Now we're like super white. Right? They used to kill us and hate us because we didn't have a state. What kind of people is this without a state, right? Now we have a state and it's thriving and it's happy, the happiness chart, so they don't like us for that. So the real problem when we talk about anti-Israelism and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is the West falling out of love with itself, hating itself, feeling guilty about itself. And the Jews are the easiest targets. The Jews are a symptom of Western imperialism, or the best, easiest example of Western imperialism. That's number one. And the broad fight there will be between the classic liberals like you and me. Classic liberals believe in equal opportunity for everybody, regardless of race, color, or creed. And the progressives who are taking over the left, who believe in equal results. And if you don't have, according to them, if one group is doing better than another group, these guys have exploited these guys to get there, right? So that's very, very dangerous. So the bigger fight outside of this Israel thing, a precursor to the Israel thing, is the fight for Western classic liberalism that we're losing, right? And you'll see this within the Democratic Party. You'll see. You got the Keith Ellisons and you got the older Henry Scoop Jackson part, whatever's left of it. So that's very interesting. And for that, people ought to look at some interesting authors that are coming up that I can't remember at the moment. But that's one. Inside the Jewish world, where we are under ideological assault every day on the campuses, now in the high schools, in the liberal churches, where you have college administrators, pusillanimous, cowardly college administrators who won't stand up to the leftist marauders. And Jewish life in the West is getting to be a little risky. The Jews have to wake up. They have to understand what the new anti-Semitism is. They have to understand that anti-Israelism is not legitimate criticism of the Jewish state, but it's unique hatred and the fomenting of hatred and the highlighting and focusing on Jewish misconduct. That's what classical anti-Semitism was anyway. Now it's applied to Israel, not Jews individually or the Talmud or Judaism. They have to understand that, and they have to get rid of their sleepy Jewish leaders who are just accepting this and guarding their salaries and pretending it's all going to work out in the end. That's what really has to happen.
Yeah, and by the way, I would apply the same standards to the Black community. They have the same sleepy leaders who aren't taking a look at what's in their best interest.
Yes.
But, it's ultimately, I think, a spiritual war that is going on within Judaism, and that really goes back centuries, and it's an ongoing thing. And, of course, what you're saying now, Charles, is rational, it's reasonable, it's true, but that doesn't matter for some of these young people who aren't interested in truth. If you talk to them, and I have, you engage them a little bit, you realize that it has nothing to do with any of this.
Right.
It's an emotional thing, and it's difficult to reach somebody like that. It's possible to peel a few of them off, but for the most part, they are involved in, I don't know, for lack of a better word, almost a cult.
Yes.
And, it's like, how do you reach someone like that? How do you argue with someone like that?
Nobody knows how to reach somebody like that. I think nobody knows. This has to be a deep, deep and long war of ideology that goes to the heart of the matter of what is social life supposed to be, what is success, what is achievement, what does equality really mean, what is justice, and the left has dominated and won those discussions in the intellectual realms, or at least in the academic realms,
right?
So
and
that
in the cultural realms, they tend to hold the high ground,
right? But I think that there are interesting things. There's a man named Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, who's doing work on free speech on the campuses. We win the free speech war. That's really important, and the why of free speech and the search for truth, and that's very, very important. So that's on the battlefield of classical liberalism versus progressivism. Those are all important wars. But this is listen. We're in a very tough time. It's going to be very difficult for the Jewish people coming up, I'm afraid to say. More and more people are waking up, even some people in our establishment organizations.
Good.
So we got to keep
and I feel optimistic about that as well. Charles Jacobs, you've touched on a lot of issues for us to think about. I'd like to have you back and do a whole series with you, and I really appreciate you joining me this afternoon. Again, mention, if you will, how people can reach you, how they can look at your work, and some websites, etc.
The website to look at is peace, www.peace, PEACEAND, tolerance, peaceandtolerance.org, and you'll find all of our work there.
All right, Charles Jacobs, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon.